Aloha, my dear siblings in Christ. I'm recording this message for Monday, August 24th, 2020. But I'm doing the recording on Friday, Statehood Day. Largely because the Diocesan Support Center, and historically the Office of the Bishop, doesn't close on Statehood Day. Now, one of the practices that I've taken on during this time of the pandemic is reading through the Bible. I'm actually reading it through in the King James Version. But this morning I was reading through the Psalms. And I read Psalm 93. I'll use the translation from the prayer book. But I found it very important and moving. The Lord is King. He has put on splendid apparel. The Lord has put on his apparel and girded himself with strength. He has made the whole world so sure that it cannot be moved. Ever since the world began, your throne has been established and you are everlasting. The waters have lifted up, O Lord, the waters have lifted up their voice. The waters have lifted up their pounding waves. Mightier than the sound of mighty waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea, mightier is the Lord who dwells on high. Your testimonies are sure. Holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever and forevermore. Psalm 93 declares its theme at the beginning, the Lord is King, but it's God as a cosmic power, the world and eternity, waters, oceans, waves, breakers, the very vault of heaven, the stamp of God on all creation. I was reading it because I thought, my gosh, this is a wonderful image for Hawaii. But I will also admit that as I was reading it, I was pondering conversations that the clergy have been having with me virtually over the past couple of weeks. We've been talking about racism. Now, yes, it's driven by the presiding bishop and actions of the Episcopal Church. It's been driven by Black Lives Matter on the continental North American continent conversations. It's also been driven by the pandemic here in the islands, by those who've been most impacted by the COVID-19 virus. Poor communities, those in jail. As I heard the words, I actually began to ponder, how would King Kamehameha IV have heard them? You know, he attended school at the Royal School in Honolulu. He would have had instruction from Amos and Juliet Cook, those first teaching missionaries from the Congregationalist tradition in New England, about a steadfast God and order in life. Now, before he became king, Alexander Liholiho, as he was then known, in his mid-teens, traveled with his brother Lot to Europe with Garrett P. Judd, an American physician and missionary who had through the years become a chief advisor to King Kamehameha III. Now, they were sent to Europe for the young men's education, but it was also to solidify diplomacy and recognition, particularly as France was doing some saber rattling at the time. Now, the future king kept a journal. And it was dated from October 9th, 1849 to June 29th, 1850. And in it we meet a serious but romantic young man who is exposed to the wonders of Victorian Europe and then to the United States, meeting monarchs and presidents, He has many entries about church services and sermons, and you can see the germ that the Church of England planted in the young man that would come to fruition with the founding of the Episcopal Church here, as we have it, and his translation of the Book of Common Prayer into the language of his people. But there is a passage filled with cognitive dissonance, and I want to read it to you. June 5th, 1850, he's traveling in the United States. The next morning, while at the station waiting for the baggage to be checked, Mr. Judd told me to get into the train and secure our seats. While I was sitting looking out of a window, a man came to me and told me to get out of the carriage rather unceremoniously, saying that I was in the wrong carriage. I immediately asked him what he meant. He continued his request, finally came around by the door, and so I went out to meet him. Just as he was coming in, somebody whispered a word into his ear, and by this time I had come up to him, and I asked him the reasons for telling me to get out. He then told me to keep my seat. I took hold of his arm and asked him his reasons. What right had he in turning me out, talking to me in the way he did? And he replied to me that he had some reasons, but requested me to keep my seat. I followed him out, but he took care to be out of my way after that. I found he was the conductor, and probably had taken me for somebody's servant just because I had darker skin than he had. Confounded fool. The first time that I ever received such treatment, not in England or France or anywhere else, but in this country, I must be treated like a dog and to go and come at an American's bidding. Here, I must state that I am disappointed at the Americans. They have no manners, no politeness, and not even common civilities to a stranger. And not only in this single case, but almost everybody that one meets in traveling in the United States are saucy. Even the waiters in their hotels, in answering a bell, instead of coming and knocking at the door, they stalk into the room as if they were paying one a visit. And after one was given an order for something, they pretend not to hear or give a grunt, which cannot be exactly imitated by pen and paper, but would go something like, oh. In England, an African can pay his fare for the cars. He can sit alongside Queen Victoria. Americans talk and they think a great deal about their liberty. And strangers find that too many liberties are taken from their comfort, just because his hosts are a free people. To be sure, there are many exceptions, and those are most generally found among those that have traveled in foreign countries and learnt better manners than that of their own raw coarse bearing in their country. Now, can you imagine that teenager? His missionaries had been teaching about faith and about a worldview, about constitutionality and liberty, so that the world the young man encountered was in conflict with what he taught. Now I imagine, though, those early Congregationalist missionaries from New England might have had something in mind of the Puritan leader John Winthrop, who crafted a model Christian charity, remember? He wrote, "We must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in his work we have undertaken, so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. Behind all of this is something that I've learned can be called Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. It is and became American exceptionalism. This grand narrative is responsible for the culture that determined the lives of many people in North America. The enslaved African population, the displaced Native American population. It has become vital to American identity, if not its very existence. And that same exceptionalism has shaped the life of these islands for over 150 years. I suspect the struggle of the young man to make sense of the pain of rejection, to make sense of his teachers, to make sense of the struggles of his people. Remember, the brothers were sent to Europe because the islands were threatened with annexation by France. The loss of identity. This would impact King Kamehameha IV for the rest of his troubled life. This isn't exceptional. Remember Samuel Clemens, who would become Mark Twain? When he was here in the islands writing for a sacramental newspaper, a young newspaper man, his words about Bishop Staley, the first Anglican bishop, reflect an attitude that would infect the islands. One of the first things Bishop Staley did when he arrived, Clemens writes, here a few years ago, was to write home that the missionaries had deprived, the missionaries meaning those American New England missionaries, had deprived the natives of their innocent sports and pastime, such as the lascivious hula hula and the promiscuous bathing in the surf. And one of the next things he did was to attend a hula hula in Waikiki with his holy head tricked out in flowers and evergreen trumpetry worn by the hula girls. When the late King Kamehameha IV died. When the late king died, the bishop revived the half-forgotten howling and hula dancing and other barbarisms and allowed it in the palace yard and officiated there as some sort of master of ceremonies. For many a year before he came, the wretched of all wretched musical abortions, the tom-tom, had not been heard near the heart of Honolulu. But he reinstated it and brought it into its ancient esteem and popularity. So the struggle is, how can our Christian faith be lived out without being captured by a particular culture or a moment in time? We are the heirs of the king's struggle. Whether it be colorism and shadeism, the way we look at the world, our judgments of other people, of how we put power into place in our own church, are reflected in the king's reflections as a young man. Now I think you and I, Episcopalians, have to look to our core values as a diocese. Remember the three? First crafted by Pua Hopkins years ago. We search for mana. The holy that exists in all of creation, that moves us to God, the holy, the spiritual basis of our being. It's what the psalm talked about today. It was the Creator. Mana. Secondly, malama. It is our responsibility to care for one another, especially the stranger, those in prison, those rejected, those who are houseless. If the first mana reflects the Creator, this reflects Jesus Christ, the Incarnate One. This is God present to care for one another. And the third, we are to live pono. We are to live in right relationship with one another. That means there must be true respect, true welcome. This is the living presence of God, the Holy Spirit, in our lives right now. Here, we cannot pretend that all is wonderful and beautiful. Creation is beautiful, and then as human beings we threaten it. The way we treat one another can be harmful, as some grow very wealthy and others are left in poverty. We are heirs of a past, of a history, of an illegal overthrow of a government and a monarchy, and the immoral annexation of the islands by the United States. We are the heirs of a settler culture where workers came from Asia and from Europe, from Puerto Rico, to work in the fields and to become part of our life. And of an indigenous people, the Kanakamole, who were displaced and not heard. It will be up to us in the next generations to reimagine the Commonwealth of God in these islands. But we have the promise of the Psalm. Remember? Your testimonies are very sure, and holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever and forevermore. So I've asked the clergy to continue this conversation and to then extend it to the whole diocese, to ask, how shall we live? How shall we leave the church for the children and our grandchildren? And how shall we leave our island community as the Commonwealth of God? Mahalo. So please remember, my friends, you are loved by God. As your bishop, I love you. I pray for you every day. Please pray for me. Aloha.